Vous avez un plan? Non, plus qu'un.
Vous pouvez choisir.
Magnifique. Lequel on choisit? Vous tirez bien alors. Hein. Seuls les billets gagnants sont je sais pas quoi.
Parfait. Pour les photos, il faut descendre à droite de la maison là.
Après dans le village?
Oui.
Ouais.
Et puis maintenant, tout de suite bientôt.
La partie officielle?
Exactement.
Depuis 2013, l'EDA, École de design et Haute École d'art du Valais, questionne le positionnement et les pratiques d'artistes contemporains opérant sur le territoire rural.
Moi, ce qui me frappe, c'est que dans les milieux ruraux, il y a 30 ans, très peu d'élus se posaient la question de savoir s'ils devaient faire quelque chose en matière culturelle. Ils ne se la posaient pas. Maintenant, ils se la posent presque tous.
Ce territoire attire des artistes qui ne travaillent plus exclusivement en atelier, mais au cœur de la société, en mettant leurs pratiques à l'épreuve du réel.
Est-ce que le fromage de Bagne a un centre? Est-ce qu'il a une périphérie?
Là, il y a beaucoup de choses qui se passent sur les territoires non métropolitains.
Ce qui se passe aujourd'hui, c'est la sortie du monde de l'art. C'est-à-dire qu'on va négocier, non pas avec des gens qui sont dans le monde de l'art, mais avec des acteurs qui, eux, ne sont pas dans le monde de l'art et qui, quelquefois, n'ont donc pas les codes du monde de l'art.
Les industries de loisirs et de divertissement, les parcs d'attractions, le tourisme, l'hôtellerie, le sport, le jeu, le jouet, les loisirs créatifs. Voilà, la culture définition 2017, c'est ça.
De tels artistes s'intéressent au territoire rural pour son contexte culturel et social, mais aussi parce que ce territoire est un marché en plein essor.
Das braucht es, weil wir sind die Generalisten, sage ich. Wir können nicht überall die coolen Ideen haben.
De son côté, le territoire rural est en demande de culture pour répondre à des changements structuraux. Traditionnellement consacrée à l'agriculture et à l'exploitation de ressources naturelles, la campagne a été le témoin, depuis l'après-guerre, d'un phénomène d'urbanisation et de tertiarisation qui a fait du tourisme une de ses ressources principales. De ce point de vue, l'art représente une plus-value dont les collectivités publiques et les secteurs économiques ont pris ou commencent à prendre conscience.
Investir dans la culture, pour toute une série de raisons, ça favorise le développement des territoires.
Tout naturellement, le monde de l'art et les autres secteurs se sont donc retrouvés autour des mêmes projets et une véritable économie de projet s'est mise en place qui profite en principe à tout le monde. Complémentaire au marché de l'art, cette économie de projet prend de plus en plus de place dans la vie des artistes. Elle offre de nouveaux débouchés et représente un champ d'expérimentation privilégié pour les pratiques actuelles. Il était donc important de mieux comprendre comment elle fonctionne. Entre 2013 et 2020, l'EDA a consacré 3 projets de recherche à l'économie de projet. Intitulé Ars Contemporaneus Alpinus, le premier projet est remonté aux sources du land art dans l'ouest des États-Unis.
The idea of the location is very important. The remoteness is extremely important. And that provides the protection and the space. It has to be done where it can remain remote and use the space as part of the work.
Il s'agissait de comprendre comment des pratiques artistiques qui étaient à l'avant-garde dans les années 60-70 sont devenues une stratégie de développement territorial à travers le modèle des parcs à sculptures paysagers, comme ceux qui se sont récemment développés en Valais, sur le modèle de Grizedale Sculpture en Angleterre ou de Vassivière en France.
To make popular this project to a larger community, we have to have these huge big names. And then for me it was quite clear that they want to brand this region as a land art valley.
I think the first thing to do is to throw out entirely concepts like site specificity, prospect of the sculpture park, just all of these are not concepts germane to this area at all.
Opérant depuis le village de Létron, en Valais, Creative Villages s'est focalisé sur la présence de l'art contemporain dans des villages, en servant notamment de plateforme pour questionner les attentes des actrices et des acteurs impliqués dans l'économie de projet.
L'art contemporain, la culture contemporaine ne doit pas être l'apanage des villes.
T'as le ski, t'as les restos, t'as la nature, mais et si on offrait une page culture, quoi? Est-ce que...
Bah oui. Mais bon, est-ce que vraiment toute la population arrive à être intéressée?
Je pense que la plus grande question, c'est plutôt de savoir comment le faire pousser de l'intérieur, c'est ça en fait.
Quant aux nouveaux produits du terroir, il s'est intéressé aux modes de fonctionnement et au positionnement d'artistes qui ont tourné l'économie de projet à leur avantage, en trouvant un point d'équilibre entre enjeux artistiques et locaux, faisant ainsi du territoire rural un terreau pour le renouvellement des pratiques artistiques. Cette dernière recherche a révélé que l'économie de projet n'est pas qu'une manière de faire coopérer le monde de l'art avec les autres secteurs. Le projet est devenu une forme d'art en soi, dont la forme la plus caractéristique se trouve chez les artistes socialement engagés, qui entrevoient les organisations, le management, la créativité, l'opérativité et l'intersectorialité comme autant de médiums au service d'une nouvelle conception de l'art. De ce point de vue, en effet, l'art n'est plus un langage visuel pour interpréter le monde et lui donner du sens, mais un moyen d'action pour opérer au cœur du réel. Pour tester cette hypothèse, nous nous sommes focalisés sur le travail de 6 artistes en charge de 4 projets réalisés en Europe. Tous deux basés dans le Haut-Valais, Carlo Schmidt et Pascal Seiler ont décidé dès 1998 de mettre leur créativité au service de leur communauté dans la région de l'Oesch, dans le but d'apporter des solutions concrètes à des problèmes locaux. Travaillant de manière socialement engagée avant qu'une telle catégorie ne soit pleinement reconnue par le champ de l'art, ces artistes ont été actifs en dessous du radar, sans chercher la moindre publicité, tout en continuant de collaborer avec des galeries et des institutions artistiques.
Ich bin nicht nur da gewesen, habe meine Kunst gemacht und gesagt, die Bank muss abkaufen, die Versicherung muss abkaufen, der Kanton muss mir ein Stipendium geben und so weiter. Und ich kann meine Sache machen. Sondern ich bin für mich persönlich ist es angenehmer, korrekter, wenn ich das in einem Austausch mache, dass ich der Gesellschaft etwas zurückgebe, dass ich da, was ich kann, und Möglichkeiten sehe, dass ich da euch interveniere, dass ich aktiv bin und euch projektmässig mich einbringe. Da, was ich kann und wo ich euch das Gefühl habe, kann ich etwas bringen.
Carlo Schmidt et Pascal Seiler ont fait œuvre de pionniers en Valais, à une époque où l'économie de projet commençait tout juste à se mettre en place à l'échelle internationale. Ils ont mené à bien plus d'une 50aine de projets à travers l'entreprise 1,5 qu'ils fondèrent ensemble, mettant leur créativité au service d'une école alternative, d'un hôpital régional, d'un parc naturel ou d'un village confronté à un problème de dépopulation.
Man muss natürlich auch sehen, die Idee, die der Künstler vorher in ein Konzept reingetan hat, also sei es jetzt eine Installation oder sonst ein Konzept, hat man natürlich nicht, in der Gesellschaft nicht verstanden, dass man das auch in die Gesellschaft rein interpretieren kann. Oder? Das war immer quasi, das ist ein Bild, das ist Kunst und die Schnittstelle hat es nicht gegeben. Also die Gesellschaft hat noch nicht gemerkt, dass eigentlich eine konzeptuelle Arbeit von einem Künstler, das Gedankengut kann man auch in einer Gesellschaft anwenden. Oder? Das kann man auch für touristische Probleme nutzen. Oder man kann das auch für eine Wertsteigerung nutzen, von einem Bergdorf. Oder das kann soziale Aspekte drin haben, wo man merkt, okay, mit dieser Idee kann man eine Veränderung in einem Dorf bringen oder eine Veränderung in einer Gesellschaft reinbringen, ohne dass das ein Produkt ist, sondern es ist nur eine Idee oder eine Wahrnehmung, die sich verändert hat. Oder?
Basé à Amsterdam, Curdin Tones a lancé une initiative artistique du nom de Somalgor 74 dans son village de Tchlin, dans les Grisons. Ce projet a débuté par la rénovation de sa maison de famille qui sert dorénavant d'espace d'accueil pour un programme culturel et d'hébergement pour des artistes, curateurs et chercheurs que l'artiste commença à inviter dès 2016.
La famille qui fait le magasin, ils habitent là, il y a les paysans, ils habitent là, il y a les... chaque profession a un peu la maison. Cette maison ici, c'est la profession de l'art, disons. Maintenant, c'est l'artiste qui vit ici, qui travaille ici, d'ici, de cette maison, on va créer l'énergie, on va transmettre l'énergie dans la communauté.
Impliqué dans la communauté de son village, Curdin Tones voit Somalgore 74 comme une plateforme pour générer des échanges entre culture locale et culture contemporaine. Pour ce faire, il sollicite la population locale et l'implique dans son travail. Un des projets phares de Somalgore 74 est un bain public sous forme de jacuzzi installé dans une des fontaines du village. Faisant écho à la mode du wellness, liée au développement touristique, ce projet questionne l'évolution des pratiques sociales de son village, dont les fontaines furent un élément central. Fondé en 2003 par les artistes Kathrin Böhm, Wabke Finstra et Antje Schiffers, basés respectivement à Londres, Rotterdam et Berlin, Myvillages est une organisation indépendante qui génère des projets artistiques participatifs dans des villages et des communautés locales à travers le monde. Si certains de ces projets répondent à des invitations ponctuelles, d'autres, comme The International Village Shop, Company Drinks ou I Like Being a Farmer, se déploient sur le long terme. À travers ces projets, Myvillages fait partie d'un réseau international d'organisations qui ont mis la problématique du rural au centre de leurs préoccupations. Toutes les trois nées à la campagne, Kathrin Böhm, Wabke Finstra et Antje Schiffers ont développé des formes spécifiques de pratiques socialement engagées à partir du territoire rural qui intègrent les modes de production, les ressources, la culture et les savoir-faire propres à ce territoire. Ce collectif considère le rural comme un concept critique qui renvoie à des particularismes culturels, à des manières de penser et d'agir. Opérant aussi bien dans des villages que dans des institutions reconnues du monde de l'art, Myvillages a été invité à éditer une publication consacrée au rural dans la série Documentaire of Contemporary Art de la Whitechapel Gallery. À sa sortie en 2019, ce livre a fait l'objet d'une exposition, d'un séminaire et d'événements sur le rural organisés dans la galerie londonienne.
I got to know Kathrin in Mexico in '99, and she already knew Wabke, and it was Kathrin's brilliant idea to bring us together. So kind of a planned come together, and then we first went to each other's village. So we showed each other our villages, because we all come from small villages. Wabke is the daughter of a dairy farmer in Friesland, like north of Holland. I come from this farm in this one, like this farm in northern Germany, and Kathrin from a southern German village. And at that point, the rural was really not a subject in art. It was all about urbanism and urbanism again. And so we thought, well, we also have a cultural background. That's not a void. So I guess if at that moment some curator would have told us, well, let's do something about it, maybe that it would have been. But as nobody did, so we said, well, then we have to take the initiative ourselves. And then we founded this kind of NGO or this initiative.
It started with us three, that's Antje, Wabke, myself, realizing that we would describe ourselves as socially engaged practitioners, but we would never socially engage in a rural context, even though we come from rural backgrounds. And that has to do with the kind of cultural hegemony of the urban. You know, if you want to do art, you move into the city, you go to an academy, the infrastructures are there. So it came from this really self-critical question of like, why don't we consider the rural as a place to work? To then realize, okay, there's also no interest or infrastructure for that. And then out of that frustration, we started Myvillages to say we want to actively explore but also declare the rural as a place for and of cultural production in relation to our practice. So it's not autobiographical, it's also in the beginning it was to open through support structures, through solidarity with each other and others, to open up the rural as a possible place for contemporary art.
We like the choice of where we work to be very random. Because I'm very suspicious of really choosing a place, because it is so difficult then not to go for the nicest, nice people, nice landscape. Well, there anyhow is a place where you can stay, good food or something alike, a lot of sun or whatever. So I like it not to be like that, because there's also a lot of relatively boring places that are interesting too. So I really try to avoid searching for the good ones.
I hate the Lake District. It's a horrible place. And I've never really liked it. And you know, this local community here is a narrow, embittered, deeply competitive, pretty small-minded. It's not something you would voluntarily buy into. So, and I think the Lake District itself is massively corrupted by tourism, and I don't have a lot of good things to say about the Lake District. What I do have to say good about the Lake District is that it's complex, and it's filled with ideas and cultural differences and antagonisms, and it's intense and it's rich. So this is an album cover from 1950s, and from Black Baptist gospel music, and it represents a rural culture, Black American culture, and the reference in it was to the Great Migration of 1919, when the Black Southern America moved to the north, to Chicago and Detroit.
En 1999, Adam Sutherland est nommé à la tête de Grizedale Arts dans le Lake District pour redonner du sens à ce projet qui fut un des berceaux du land art anglais dans les années 70-80. Après son entrée en fonction, cependant, des tensions survenues avec la Forestry Commission, instigatrice du projet, provoquèrent une scission. Le parc à sculptures revint alors dans le giron de cette commission, sous le nom de Grizedale Sculpture, et Sutherland relocalisa Grizedale Arts non loin de là, sur le site historique de la ferme de Lawson Park, près du village de Coniston. Grizedale Arts opère aussi bien sur son territoire qu'à l'extérieur, sur demande, à travers un programme de résidence. De tels projets peuvent être commissionnés par des institutions artistiques reconnues, comme la Biennale de Sao Paulo, Frieze Art Fair ou la Galerie Häuser & Wirth, ou par des communautés locales sans lien avec le milieu de l'art. À Coniston, cette organisation a notamment remis en fonction une ancienne institution locale, le Coniston Institute, qui comprend une salle de fête, une bibliothèque réalisée par l'artiste Liam Gillick et un Honest Shop, magasin participatif géré par la communauté. Au fil des années, Adam Sutherland a développé sa propre vision de l'art, inspirée par la pensée de John Ruskin et par le mouvement Art and Craft. Une vision fondée sur la notion d'utilité de l'art que chaque projet permet de mettre à l'épreuve.
So what I'm looking at the moment is something that I'm calling the Confederacy of Villages, which is about developing 4 villages, all with similar conditions. So they all have a strong heritage element. They all have a relatively engaged community, and they all have some kind of architecture, design, contemporary art, infrastructure to some extent, some kind of something we can key into and work with. And what we're looking at is setting up exchanges that are probably led in a subtle way by art and artists, but are really exchanges of working people. So what we've just done in Japan is 2 joiners from the village helped us dismantle a Japanese house and rebuild some other buildings from the parts of that house. and the impact, I think, that has on all of us, everybody that was involved in that, it becomes a very creative impulse. So I don't think that you come back from doing something like that to then doing something extremely banal and repetitive that's already happening locally. There's a kind of level of energizing and inspiration and broader thinking that comes out of that process.
Moi, je pense qu'il y aura toujours des gens qui arriveront à utiliser le système qui existe pour finalement faire les choses qui les intéressent.
Ce sont ces manières d'utiliser le système qui nous intéressent ici, plus que les projets artistiques eux-mêmes. À travers les 4 exemples présentés, nous verrons quels peuvent être les modes d'action d'artistes qui ont fait du projet un médium en soi.
I wanted to study art, not really to become an artist, but because of this promise of freedom. You know, that it's a discipline where things don't necessarily have to be efficient or commercial or profit-orientated. So that's why I don't come from an art family, I don't come from an art background. So I chose art as this promise of doing things differently. And then very early on, I kind of realized that I don't want to have the audience that's interested in art as my only public. Yeah, I didn't just want to communicate with people who are interested in art. I wanted to think of art as something that's part of everyday culture. And that's also my understanding of art. It's one particular form of culture amongst many other forms of culture. So this term of like cultural democracy drives my thinking. And then, I looked for ways to work outside of the institutionalized art context. So the first organization I set up with Andreas Lang and others was Public Works, and it was an art and architecture studio. So it was clearly a transdisciplinary practice where I took my practice in the realm of architecture/public space. And then that kind of interest of like working with others within public spaces outside of the art context continued with Myvillages, where we clearly opened up the rural as a place for practice. So my work has been described as different things as the language has moved on, you know, from socially engaged to participatory to relational and so on. I prefer to call it just art.
Für einen anderen Künstler, der sagt, für mich ist der richtige Weg, ich gehe in die Landschaft mit einem Stativ und mache ein realistisches Landschaftsbild. Das ist auch korrekt. Für ihn ist das richtig und für einen anderen Künstler ist ein anderer Weg der richtige. Aber für mich jetzt persönlich ist dieser Weg der richtige, weil ich das Gefühl habe, wenn ich Bilder mache und die Wand stelle, in Galerien, Museen ausstelle, wenn ich weiter denke, was passiert mit denen? Also in 20, 30 Jahren werden die in einem Keller sein vom Museum, im Archiv sein von der Galerie oder vielleicht noch irgendwo in einem Gang, in einem Korridor von der Familie und nur 20 Jahre später sind sie irgendwo in einer Brückenstube oder irgendwo. Und hat dann mein Leben Sinn gehabt, nur für die Sachen zu produzieren, die im Keller sind. Und ich habe das Gefühl, ich kann mehr bewirken mit dem Talent, Kreativität in der Gesellschaft drin, indem ich versuche, mit anderen zusammen Projekte zu entwickeln, die der Gesellschaft oder dem Einzelnen oder der Randgruppe oder dem Bauer oder wer auch immer hilfreich sein und ihm etwas bringt.
Just after art school, I had a grant, a DID grant for Mexico. And when I applied for it, you apply for it in a kind of a procedure to it, and you apply for it really in person. So you can be there and explaining to the big committee who or gives you the grant or not what you want to do. And then I had the idea of presenting to them that I did not want to go to any art school in Mexico because that's what it it's normally meant for postgraduate studies. And I wasn't interested in these postgraduate studies because I thought, well, if I go to a Mexican art school, I will just find people who are relatively like myself, and that's boring to me. So I went there with the idea of staying in a village, and that I made that my obligation.
The huge difference for us was when we stopped trying to bring art and calling it art and thinking of it as art. We stopped trying to bring that and give it to people and tell them they were interested in it and tell them why they should be interested in it. And we changed the approach and we waited for people to invite us to bring something, to help them with something. We think about how art would be useful in everyday life, in what way that would enhance people's experience of living in a very fundamental way. In many ways that is to make that a more interesting place to live, a more complex and richer.
I can understand that. So, because often, I'm quite often invited also by, as now it became more common to invite artists who work in the rural. And so I'm often invited to some artist association meetings to talk about my experience or something alike. And then people talk about it being difficult going to the village and not being accepted as artists. And then I also think, wait, is it so important that you present yourself as artists in the first place? Maybe not. Because what does it mean in the end? So I think he's right. I just went, there's quite a nice show at Akademie der Künste at the moment, and there's called The Great Repair, and there's a manifesto of some artist from the 70s, and I don't remember her name. But she gives the quotation that she seems to have from somewhere, I don't know if it is Burma or Bali or something with B, I think. And it's not Belgium, but it's... And then she says, we don't have art, we try to do everything good. And I liked it so much. So we don't have art or we don't need art, something alike. We just try to do everything good. And that is, of course, an interesting idea of what art, or we just try to fill everything we do, like everyday practice, with culture. That's what it means, I guess. That you try to put enough concentration, creativity, and into every detail of your everyday life. So that is nice. I like that.
Also die Ausgangslage ist ja so, dass irgendwo gibt es ein Problem. Und dann kommen Leute zu uns und sagen, du, wir haben ein Problem, können wir uns da weiterhelfen? Oder umgekehrt, wir selber beobachten irgendetwas in der Gesellschaft und sagen, oh, da könnte man irgendwie so und so eine Lösung herbringen. Und dann geben wir Zino und sagen, wir haben einen Vorschlag, wir sehen es uns, die Lesungen so und so zu machen. Und so hat es gegeben, dass ein Bergdorf, Fischberterben, hat ein Problem gehabt. Sie hatten mehrere Häuser gehabt, Ökonomiegebäude, die sind am Zusammenkommen waren. Sie hatten ein Dorfladen gehabt, das zu wenig Umsatz hatte. Das Magazin hat einfach zu wenig Umsatz gehabt. Man hat gesagt, oh, müssen wir das schließen oder können wir so verhalten. Sie hatten Buslinien vom Tal zum Bergdorf, die zu wenig Frequenzen hatten. Und haben gesagt, wenn wir nicht mehr Leute kriegen, müssen wir Linien streichen. Also es sind verschiedene Probleme gehabt. Wenn die Ökonomiegebäude am Zusammenkommen sind, ist auch das Ortsbild ist nicht mehr schön, wenn die ganzen Ruinen sind. Und dann haben wir das angeschaut und dann haben wir gesagt, okay, wir müssen eine Lesung finden, wo man die Ökonomiegebäude wieder instand stellen, restaurieren. Und wir müssen eine Lösung finden, dass Leute aufgehen in das Bergdorf. Da hat man die Buslinien, die kaufen etwas, so hat das Magasin mehr Umsatz und das Bergdorf hat eine bisschen bessere Chance für zu überleben. Und da haben wir dann gesagt, wir machen mit Künstlern zusammen, die in diesen Ökonomiegebäuden Spiellandschaften machen für Kinder. Das heisst, dann kommen Kinder auf spielen, die Eltern gehen ins Restaurant, die gehen ins Magasin und die Objekte kommen und erhalten. Und dann haben wir das skizziert und im Team mit anderen zusammen, mit Architekten, mit verschiedenen anderen, haben wir die Lesungen gefunden. Im Team zusammen und auch im Dorf. Also wir haben das Dorf eingeladen, haben Workshops gemacht und so und haben das rübergebracht. Und dann haben wir Künstlerkollegen eingeladen, Studenten von der EK. Und dann haben wir mit denen zusammen das Konzept entwickelt und auch wir sind nachher mit anderen zusammen Geld holen. Und dann haben wir 1 Million Geld gesammelt. Und dann sind wir also nicht ganz 1 Million gewesen, sind wir zurückgekommen und haben nachher das realisiert und umgesetzt. Und dann hat es zum Beispiel 200'000 Stutz Preise gegeben für das Projekt. Und die haben wir auch ins Projekt reingesteckt, so dass man circa genau jetzt alles zusammen mit den Preisgeldern hat man 1 Million investieren. Man hat die Gebäude erhalten, man hat das Ortsbild erhalten, man hat ungefähr 3000 Besucher, die hier spielen. Das heisst, das Geschäft, die Buslinie, man hat die Ziele erreicht. Oder? Und das ist so ein Projekt, wo man eigentlich unsere Problemstellung wissen, mit Kunst hat man ganz neue Geschichten gemacht.
Normally, there's an invitation to us.
Ah, you're invited?
We are invited. But normally, the invitation does not necessarily come from the village. It could come from a nearby art institution. And then we would say, maybe there's a museum somewhere, and we would say, well, we are rather interested in working in the surrounding villages. Maybe there's a budget that would normally be meant for transport, for exhibition, and we say, well, let's rather use it for that. Okay. And so we walk out of this context and take it there. I'll show you some pictures. So the Bundeskulturstiftung initiated a big program called Überlebenskunst, which means kind of the art of survival, or yeah, that's how you could phrase it. And it was meant to, it was like 14 years ago, and it was meant to approach all questions of sustainability and of having a good life without taking too much of the planet, let's say, no? Justice in using the resources, something like that. And so they wanted to have a look at it from a cultural point of view. And because I did this these barter trades with the farmers, they approached me and to ask me if I had an idea of how to feed this festival, in which was kind of the main outcome of that program. And so I did bring in my villagers to do it together. And so they were expecting 5,000 guests, 8,000 came, and we had to feed them over 5 days. So it was quite a lot that was needed. And so we were given all the power of imagining everything in it and shaping everything in it. Like who would eat what, in what way? Would it be festive? Would it be casual? Would it be whatever? Would there be meat? So everybody expected it to be vegan. But we said, no, wow, it's part of the, especially for the celebration culture of most countries, of most parts of the world, especially for a celebration to slaughter an animal. So we did. And so we found a calf in Berlin to be slaughtered for it. And Wapke wrote a beautiful text about this. And we had this hydroponic, here this is Haus der Kultur der Welt. And then we had this hydroponic salad field in front of it. And this was because we thought it also makes sense much of the project was like us trying something out. So Thomas and me, we picked mushrooms and dried them here in this apartment. Everything was covered with mushrooms to dry. It was horrible because first it smells good, but after a week it is such a dense mushroom smell. It was unsupportable. But so we didn't only want these images of very, these hippie-esque images, these romantic images of you just go to the forest and you will find enough. And so we also wanted some more contemporary attempt of how to feed the world with some new ideas. So this hydroponic salad field. And Wapke worked hard on that. That was a Dutch company doing it. And as there are these water basins, that is the perfect place for it.
C'était une idée vite. Et après, j'ai pensé, mais comment on pourrait vraiment travailler avec cette idée si on la prend au sérieux aussi, cette idée. Et j'ai invité des habitants du village, j'ai proposé cette idée et j'ai demandé qu'est-ce que vous pensez, comment cette idée peut-elle devenir forte dans notre contexte culturel. Après cette discussion, je suis allé voir le tourisme local aussi, et il y a une coordinatrice de tourisme, et j'ai proposé ce plan, on a discuté, elle était vraiment tout à fait enthousiaste de l'idée, elle a immédiatement vu le potentiel touristique, mais aussi le potentiel culturel. Et de ce moment-là, on a travaillé ensemble et j'ai essayé de maintenir les deux côtés, l'intérêt touristique et l'intérêt culturel dans le projet. Ça, c'était en janvier. Après, j'ai développé le design des éléments, le parcours wellness, quelles sont les étapes, comment on va produire ça, comment ça coûte. Enfin, on a fait le budget. Puis, elle a proposé le budget à la commission touristique communale. La commission touristique communale a décidé, oui, on veut avancer ce projet. Et puis, ils ont proposé ce projet à la communauté politique. Et la communauté politique, en mai, ils étaient d'accord. Ils ont mis l'argent sur la table, disons. Et de là, j'ai commencé pratiquement à développer les éléments, construire les éléments et finir la scène. Le 14 juillet, on a ouvert le projet ici. Et après, dès le 14 juillet, 8 fois chaque samedi, on a fait le bain public de 3h l'après-midi jusqu'à 10h le soir. Le premier jour qu'on a fait, on a eu la télé suisse ici, on a eu 3 journaux ici, donc ça a aussi beaucoup aidé à aimer visibilité, mais aussi à la gens de voir, mais c'est pas tellement fou.
Ouais.
Die Art und Weise, wie Curdin vorgegangen ist, das Projekt zu realisieren, war für mich natürlich angenehm oder einfach bekannter vielleicht, als wenn jetzt jemand einfach nur mit der Idee gekommen wäre, ohne irgendwelche Vorgehensweisen. Also ich konnte mich da sehr gut wiederfinden und das macht es natürlich einfacher. Jetzt für jemanden, der nicht so viel mit Kultur und Kunst vielleicht jeden Tag zu tun hat. Wir haben uns einerseits darauf konzentriert, möglichst viele Leute zu erreichen, die hier in der Region sind, also um diesen Tagestourismus anzukurbeln, also dass wir uns dort treu bleiben in dieser Strategie. Und dafür haben wir diese Broschüre produziert, die dann komplett in allen Haushaltungen hier im Unterengadin ausgeteilt wurde und überall in den Hotels auflag, in Restaurants, in Geschäften hier. Also, dass wir so wirklich sehr viele Leute erreichen.
En plus, dans cette brochure, il y avait un chapitre sur l'histoire des fontaines. Il y avait les règlements des fontaines en roumanche et en allemand. Il y avait tout le rite, les plans du projet, de la fontaine publique. Il y avait tout le rituel. Donc, il y avait tout dedans. Donc, cette brochure a fonctionné aussi très bien pour adresser les différents niveaux de lecture.
Donc, c'est vraiment à travers la brochure, tout d'un coup, que le projet redevient...
Je crois que la brochure était assez importante et j'ai aussi reçu ce feedback des habitants locaux qui ont vraiment dit que cette brochure elle est très importante parce qu'elle amène aussi le contenu des fontaines. Ce n'est pas seulement le divertissement touristique, ça parle vraiment de l'aspect social. On a aussi développé ce signe ici pour souligner l'aspect social.
So company drinks came out of me being in my villages, and we did the big pantry project together in Berlin. I don't know if you know this. In 2011, we worked with 80 food producers to fill a pantry to feed a festival, and that was like an annual seasonal production, but one-off. We did it once, and I thought I really want to come back to London, which is my hometown. London is my hometown. And I want to start something that works with the seasons, that works with food, that works with like many, many different groups to sustain not a pantry, but an organization. So I was really quite actively looking in London of like, where could this be and who with? And now we're in Barking, which is not too far from where I live. I live in Hackney. Barking is about 10 miles. And there was a local history that someone pointed out to me, which was the one of families from the East End in London going to the countryside every year to do hop picking. And a lot of cities have this relationship. You have a kind of working class community that needs a bit of money, and once a year they work as cheap seasonal labor in the countryside. And that's something I didn't know, even though I've lived in London for quite a while. So I thought, there's an interesting urban-rural connection where a working class community actually has its own rural history in East London, because this hop picking went on for like 100 years. Up to 100,000 people would go, mainly women and children. So there was something I didn't know about London before. It's this kind of like rural undercurrent that you don't see anymore. But a lot of people who come from families who went hop picking remember this. It's part of a kind of lived collective history, heritage. So that was my starting point of going like, I can see something rural in London. And this picking, what if this picking became not just a one-off capitalist moment where you pick and someone else makes the money? What if this picking became one of the very moments of a value chain that remained public and communal? And that's how the idea for company drinks was born. That we go picking again, of course, under the very different conditions. Not like in the 1950s. We live in a very different London with a very different population. But picking up, referring to this very local history of hop picking, to set up company drinks with the invitation that we go picking again, but this time we keep what we pick, we make drinks, we trade them together, and we reinvest what we make together. That's how it started. For me, it was clear from the beginning that I didn't want to do a one-off project. I wanted to set up something that was long-term. So the idea of an enterprise, that you don't do an enterprise for a year. You normally start an enterprise on the assumption that it will be successful and can stay for a while. So that was clear from the beginning, that this first money was just start-up money. It was just money for the first year. And then who would be interested? I didn't know anyone, it's not like I knew people. So like who would come to those picking trips? Who would be open to this idea of a new community, a new collective communal making? So the first year was a kind of, trying it out. And then over time it established itself. And it changed, of course.
A Fair Land is one of IMA's most important projects of 2016. The public manifestation of the project will be seen in the courtyard through August, or has been in preparation in the weeks before that, and will be a very activated space, an artist village, which will include a straw field where we'll be growing a crop, a straw barn in which we'll be processing the crop, and then a structure that will create a kind of communal space, a village hall where people can come together to discuss the ideas in the project, to sample some of the incredible food made by the artist team. But this project, although the public engagement with it will be for those very active 3 weeks in August, has been in development for a number of months.
Yeah, I think, that was the commission in a way. I mean, the commission there was, in fact, to address the commemoration of 100 years anniversary of the Irish Rising, which was led by, I mean, in simplistic terms, was led by creatives, was led by artists, mostly writers and actors and so on. And so our interpretation of that was to try and create a new society led by creative thinking, by creatives. And we used the whole residency program to try and develop and illustrate that. So the whole program there was based on volunteer contribution and translating volunteers into people that then delivered the project. So yeah, they wanted to reinvent the residency program, and we definitely showed a way of reinventing that, but there was a lot of friction in that project because they also wanted, and I don't think they thought it through, but they kind of wanted to reiterate the value of artists, and particularly Irish artists. So we had 6 Irish artists who I would describe as all being very traditional in terms of their ideas of themselves as artists. So they might have been socially engaged, but they were very much like they're the artist, and they're adding something special because they are an artist, and it's very important for them to identify themselves as such. So that was imposed on the program, and there was a lot of difficulties and friction with that because they were making their own projects within a collective endeavour. And the real value to me was, for that whole program, was the idea of the volunteer being the driver and being the valuable component in that project. And then, of course, we also had a kind of sprinkling of celebrity as well. So we had people like Suzanne Lacey and Tanya Bagheera and also Jonathan Misa. Quite an interesting kind of collision of story heritage artists, you might call them, who did what they do. None of them really made particularly great or interesting projects, but they're important to a museum, that they have identifiable names. So there was a kind of play and a challenge around that that ran through it. And I think the project ended pretty acrimoniously. We got pretty angry, pretty annoyed, and the director of the museum moved on, and they didn't appoint another director, and I think they stopped their residency program, and I think they're kind of in a process of rebuilding it. So it had quite a big impact.
Because of this project?
Who knows?
Wir haben als Künstler, wir haben damals als Künstler Offertanfragen gekriegt für irgendein Projekt in der Gesellschaft und haben die Offerte abgegeben und haben gesehen, dass immer Unternehmungen haben nachher die Arbeit bekommen und wir Künstler nicht, weil wir sie nicht akzeptiert waren. Wir waren jünger und haben noch nicht so Erfahrungsausweise gehabt. Und dann immer Unternehmungen die Offerte gekriegt und nachher sind die Unternehmungen zu uns und gesagt, ey, ihr müsst das für uns machen. Und dann wird die Arbeit gemacht und die Unternehmungen haben quasi das Geld bekommen. Und dann haben wir sagen, wir müssen auch kreativ sein und das lesen wir. Und dann haben wir quasi eine Showfirma gemacht. 1,5 hat die Firma geheissen. Und dann haben wir mit 1,5 eingegeben mit der Firma. Also wir waren ja ein Enterprise gewesen. Und dann haben wir mal die Aufträge bekommen.
I guess it is Myvillages that made it possible for us to do self-initiated work. As if you're just a single artist, it's very difficult. So for because, for example, also because funding, you can only apply to funding if you're an organization. You can't apply as an artist alone. At least that's the case in Germany, I don't know. So, and you are taken more seriously as an initiative with a certain agenda. So if we have the agenda of working against this hierarchy, cultural hierarchy between rural and urban, it's easier to do, or it's better to do it as a kind of organization.
I see my work in the coming years more within the organizational form. And there's like an organizational term within the arts where artists or cultural workers see the focus of the work more with why they do what they do, with whom they do it and how they do it, rather than what. And those first three aspects are more organizational questions of, why am I doing what I'm doing, who am I doing it with, and how. So it's a question of, I think in terms of labor, it's more reproductive labor. You know, the idea of that, if we want to establish values or practice values, we have to produce and reproduce them again. And that's for me very organizational work. And because so many of the groups and initiatives I'm part of have become long-term, there are questions of the organization. You know, how do you reproduce something after the first year? How do you reproduce ideas, practices, collaborations? So that's for me organizational practice. It's still material. It's a lot of human relations. It's organizing of resources, economies, but it's also thinking beyond the one-off project. It's to think about world building in terms of continuous, sustainable, organizational work.
So it's organizational aesthetics.
Yeah, that's the term I'm using. I'm starting to use. If you ask me again in a year, I will be more firm.
Yeah.
We had some debate over whether we should maintain open opportunity for volunteers. So in effect, anybody that volunteers can come. There's no selection process. And we're not overwhelmed, so it's just about okay, but we don't really advertise it. You have to find that on our website, and you have to come for 5 days, and you can't come for more than 5 days, and you can't come for less than 5 days, and you don't get paid. But we do support you while you're here, and we do pay your travel costs to get here, and it is a way of testing out for people to try us out, try out what we do. We offer quite a formalized program of activity which engages with lots of different areas. I think some people imagine that the volunteerships help us run, but actually they don't. They largely hinder the running of the organisation. They're not very productive in terms of work, and they're quite high. They take quite a lot of resourcing, quite a lot of energy. And then the next stage is that you become what we now term associate artist, which is kind of in the same realm as intern, but acknowledges people's interests and gives you a month to work here. And again, that was 6 weeks, so we reduced that to a month. I found you don't get irritated by people in a month, but in 5 weeks you do, and vice versa. And in that instance, you're paid, but you still largely work to the organisation you work with as part of the collective, and you don't have a huge amount of choice about what it is you're doing. We'll try and engineer it so that it fits within people's areas of interest. So if they don't like working outside, then it'll be something inside. Or if they like cooking, etc. And then the third stage is involvement in projects, where you kind of become part of the company in effect. It's probably about 60 artists who work with us regularly on a freelance basis, and who we pay them £100 a day. And that's across the board, everybody. And that that generates then smallish collectives who deliver projects. So we've actually reduced, I am the only member of staff really left at Grizedale. As staff have left, I haven't replaced them. And we use this system where we have maybe 6 different collectives now of 4 or 5 people each who deliver the programme, and the money that we either generate as earned income or get from funding from the Arts Council goes into those people. So there's I guess it's quite in a way it's quite a different approach to how you manage an arts organisation. We could comfortably have 15 members of staff. That would be the norm for what we do. Probably we would do less. We'd be less productive. Certainly we'd be less productive. We're enormously productive considering the levels of staffing we have. And that's because we have people who are there to deliver projects. That's the point of them.
Artist and this idea of instrumentalization, that's a romantic idea that we repeat in art schools, that art is autonomous. It isn't. It's a social construct that works within a capitalist logic. And I think artists are just too used to accept that selling art in galleries is the way you survive. And if you organize money differently, you're selling out. So I can't accept that narrative. Yeah? Because the market is also, you could also call it instrumentalizing, because the market is using your art for a different purpose than your intention. Systems have economics. Sometimes they don't need money. You know, you have completely non-monetary systems, then you don't have to think about organizing money. But normally you need money, because you also want to pay people. And then I find the thinking of Gibson Graham, this idea of diverse economy, is very useful, because, like, for instance, with company drinks, of course we need money, but we also need people's ideas. We need all the different things that people bring to the table to make it sustainable. So in order to think about sustainability, to think about long-term organization, you have to think about money. But still, it's your choice where you place money in its hierarchy. I mean, my village is, in that sense, it's project funded. You know, we don't have constant funding. So, like, if we get money, we organize around the money. And that money is a mix between art commissions, research funding, art prizes, exhibition fees.
I know that for the Rural School of Economics, Wabke and Kathrin once applied for European funding. And for the collaborative village play, we were funded by Allianz Stiftung and by the Goethe Institute Cooperation Fund. Sometimes we were funded or invited by Bundeskulturstiftung. In the Netherlands, we are based in the Netherlands, so that's where our institution is based, let's say. So there maybe it's also possible to apply for more regional funds, but in other places not. We only can go for the really art money in bigger contexts, because I guess most funding that is dedicated to the rural development is very local, and if you are not an institution with an address there, you can't apply for it. So we don't. We do apply to these European or national monies sometimes when it makes sense. We don't apply to residencies normally. We did when we did this book. That's when we were invited to a residency in California. That was nice. So it gave us really nice context for doing this book. But I mean, when there are programs that invite artists to work on a very specific place with a specific subject, and that is out of our own vision. So it doesn't make sense for us. Because we like these long-term projects and not so much hopping in, do something quick, do the next one. I don't know. We just didn't do that or don't do that.
Dieses Projekt hier, das war jetzt genau der richtige, oder? Da haben wir den Punkt gefunden, wo sich alle wohlgefühlt haben, wo alle beieinander waren, wo alle gefunden haben, doch, das stimmt für uns.
Le point de l'argent, c'est intéressant avec du tourisme. On a financé maintenant ce projet avec un budget communal touristique. Et moi, en plus, j'ai demandé de l'argent à la province à Coire, du support financier culturel, disons. Et eux, ils ont aussi donné un peu d'argent, mais ils avaient beaucoup de peur que le projet il est trop touristique ou que touristique et pas assez culturel. Donc, à cause des antagonismes que tu as posé la question, là, il y a vraiment aussi une peur un peu, est-ce que le projet, il est encore assez culturel ou est-ce qu'il est trop touristique? Pour moi, de mon avis, je crois que c'était vraiment un bon projet pour démontrer comment ça peut marcher ensemble. C'est aussi à moi maintenant de contrôler que les choses que je vais faire chaque an ou chaque 2 ans, je ne sais pas, ne sont pas seulement des spectacles. C'est à moi aussi de contrôler ça.
We massively address the issues for real that the Arts Council talk about and want arts organisations to do, and they don't really recognise that we're actually doing it because they only really read the rhetoric, and most arts organisations speak the rhetoric without delivering the reality. During that period, we've had, in effect, a kind of level of corruption of that idea that has really come about through funding bodies taking interest in what we're doing and commissioning studies and actually kind of disrupting the quite fragile balance of power and relations within local communities because there are highly paid consultants making suggestions about large amounts of money. So we've always worked on the basis that we didn't fundraise in the village, and although we did fairly discreetly fund things, we tried to make that relatively invisible, and suddenly you've got these kind of power, you've got these potential positions of power, and people who aren't really interested in local politics start getting involved, and yeah, it's kind of destroyed our relationship actually with the village, I would say. Number of funding agencies.
Ils sont venus ici et puis tout d'abord ils ont eu seulement les papiers, ils sont trichés ou comment on dit ça?
Ils ont analysé ton rapport.
Les idées et tout ça, et puis on a changé là les 3 experts parce qu'ils ne connaissent pas ici vraiment les problèmes et ça. Et à la fin on a discuté et puis on a dit oui, on prend quand même ce dossier qui était comme c'était avant.
Donc en fait, c'était une expertise qui a servi à rien.
Pas beaucoup, mais c'était dans les formulaires. On a besoin de nos 3 agronomes qui oui. Pour cette fois, c'était peut-être dans une autre causa, ça joue, mais ici, à mon avis, c'était rien parce qu'ils ne sont pas de ici, ils ne connaissent pas les problèmes, aussi les autres aspects, ils ne connaissent pas.
C'était une forme d'absurdité administrative.
Oui, c'était ça. Et ça coûte aussi 1080, quelque chose comme ça.
Combien ça a
180 000.
180 000 pour une expertise qui servait à rien.
Oui, ils sont quand même ici pour quelques jours, ou peut-être 2 ou 3 semaines, je ne sais plus. Mais ils sont 3 personnes et oui, tu vois, c'était comme ça.
I was once invited by Bundeskulturstiftung, the German Federal Art Funding Association, like the state funding, to become part of a big funding scheme that they have that is called TRAFO, and is which meant to encourage rural communities, but also really the administration to become interested in art and to take culture really seriously at something. And I went there and I thought it was an art project. So I in the end, I thought I misunderstood. I thought I could just make an art project out of it, which was wrong. Because I was more invited to deliver some ideas, which I did generously, but it made me feel bad, or that's not what I want to do, at least. That's what I can say.
In den 90er Jahren 2000 ist immer das grosse Vernetzen gekommen, das grosse Modewort da, vernetzen, man muss Sachen miteinander verbinden, man muss Synergien schaffen und so weiter. Das ist früher ein Wort, das man nicht kennt hat. Erst so mit der Entwicklung von der Gesellschaft gekommen, aber der Carlo hat es vorher erzählt. Also, es sind die Hierarchien sind flacher geworden, man hat gemerkt, man muss Teams schaffen, man muss Kompetenzen anzapfen, man muss schauen, dass man weil das Wissen an und für sich ist so riesig geworden, dass es immer mehr Spezialisten gibt. Es gibt immer mehr Fachidioten in Anführungszeichen.
I mean, art is completely central to everything that we do, but it is an interpretation. It isn't. The word is very broad, but if art to me is a process, and it's an action, it's something that's happening all the time, and it's quite difficult to define it because it connects other things together, and it makes sense of things, and it connects those things together for everybody, not just for artists, and you don't need to be an artist to do it. The way that the different disciplines will work in very silo, in silos. So the health sector is very introverted and inward-looking and fixated with health, and doesn't think in relation to food culture or education. I mean, people talk about these things in terms of politics, but the kind of really deeply intrinsic notion of those things being connected is achieved, I think, through that, what I would call art.
That was with a lot of different European partners, and through Erasmus funding. We organized our local projects through a translocal network that was called the Econometric School. And then Myvillages, Wapke and myself, developed the Rural School of Economics, which is now running for like 4 years, to pick up those principles, that it's translocal, informal, self-organized. But it's clearly a place for learning, and the learning focuses on land-based economies, everyday economic practices of agriculture, or, as I said earlier, community organizing. And as a tool we use drawing as a form to communicate and capture that's beyond the spoken language.
This Learn to Act was a book about the Econometric School, which was a project that at that point mainly Kathrin did, and that was bringing rural communities and just bringing different people together and making local knowledge work. And very importantly, really bringing people together who normally don't talk to each other. That was really what it was about, bringing different people together, and everybody who is invited and who took part in it was also invited to listen to the others. That was very important. Like, first listen, get used to their way of speaking, to their way of being eloquent or less, and respecting it as nevertheless full of knowledge, let's say. And so learn to act means it's really a lot about self-initiative and feeling empowered to not depend on somebody nobody has to tell you, well, that's good, you should do it, you can just do it.
Ici, ce village, il est idéal pour moi d'essayer ça parce que vraiment, je me sens lié au futur de cette communauté et je veux vraiment m'engager aussi pour cette communauté. Je ne vois pas mon rôle comme artiste comme moteur d'innovation en général. Mais de l'autre côté, je veux aussi amener quelque chose à ce village et aussi montrer aux gens que j'invite ici quelles sont les spécialités d'ici. C'est pas seulement que moi je vais innover ce village, je crois qu'il y a beaucoup que les gens qui viennent ici, qui peuvent apprendre d'ici. Donc c'est aussi le village qui peut innover les autres.
It's better, also better for facing all the challenges of the world. It's better to listen to each other and to, I mean, let's say, if from an urban point of view, you want things in agriculture to change, without listening to the farmers. Bit strange, no? Because you can feel so superior in what you want if you don't listen. And the moment you talk to people, you get at least aware that it's a bit more difficult. Or same with energy production or with all that. So I think it's good.
Oui, il y a assez de gens aussi au village qui étaient très très critiques, premièrement. Aussi parce que les fontaines, ils étaient sacrés. Parce que l'eau, c'était tout. C'était tout, vraiment. Donc c'est étrange maintenant. Pour beaucoup des vieux, c'était vraiment étrange ce qu'on a fait avec la fontaine parce qu'ils étaient tellement entraînés de maintenir propre la fontaine, de ne pas la utiliser pour que ce qu'on a décidé avec la communauté. On veut utiliser l'eau.
Aber ich denke, wenn jetzt mit dem Brunnen auf Ramosch geht oder auf Strade oder auf Fnat, dann ist was anderes. Dann geht hier was verloren, weil die Schlin ist eigentlich wichtig für gewisse Sachen. Oder? Das ist das Bund Schlin, dann ist es kulturell und dann auch wie sagt man, sehr, sehr innovativ ist Schlin, ist nicht Ramosch, ist nicht Martina oder Strada und ist auch nicht Fna.
On ne peut pas inéviter cette appropriation. D'une certaine manière, c'est un signe positif aussi, parce que vraiment les gens s'identifiaient avec ce projet.
It started as an arts commission. It was my initiative, you know. But then of course it very quickly, of course, became this more collective and communal team where people come in also with their own interests. You know, this is not a well-paid job. I come to something like this because I can also do something I want to do or want to push. So Company Drinks has become an organization. It's a small team of 4 core team members, an extended team of 8. There's 11 key holder groups, people who have keys and use the building and the site. There's a big community of around 700-800 people who would think of themselves as attached to it. And my role has become less and less over the last years. So also to a point where I don't have the time to do the work that I want to do with the care that I would like to have. So I'm stepping out as a core team member. And we're currently in a process of organization development where we're also negotiating what my role can be in the future. So it's not a definite, I'm leaving, you know, it's not dramatic. Again, it's organizational aesthetics. And in this book, there's a beautiful essay by Chun Lin Go, who also talks about how do you enter and leave organizations. And maybe you leave as the founder, but you re-enter as a junior. You know, there's something more gentle and more seasonal in terms of thinking, I initiated it and now I'm leaving. It's not thinking that suits me. And I don't think it suits many. So we're also developing, or we're working on a system where I'm stepping back with my responsibilities. I also have to write a job description, you know, like how to replace me, what am I actually doing? So that's organizational work. But we're also negotiating how I can remain in a position that's comfortable to me and to everybody else. Because as the founder, you always have a certain, you know, you have this founder's thing, you can't get rid of it.
What I found very interesting with what's been happening here in this with our local community is that we've created this useful art project, and it's been so useful and it's so valued by the community that they have taken it from us, and that's really important, that we didn't give them something. We didn't say, here, we've made this thing, now you take it on and you do something with it. We haven't offered it, but the community have decided they want it, and they've taken it from us in quite a brutal and unpleasant way. But actually that is one of the great marks of it succeeding, that there is in this kind of process, it isn't a clear, beneficial, patriarchal, top-down thing that I think you get a lot in social engagement, and you get a lot in useful art, you know, big figures promoting these ideas. It's actually I think it's a much more grainy, textured and relatively unpleasant process. So you could look at it as having successfully empowered a community and put in place a kind of sense of self-determination, that they want to take control of the future. All these things are good. But what we didn't really predict was that in doing that, you're also empowering. The empowering is fine, but you haven't necessarily changed the creative capacity of a community. So as the community have started to take back control of the Institute from us, and from the programs that we've been running, and institute their own ideas, those ideas have been drawn from largely the local area, of things that other people have done locally. They aren't very imaginative. They don't have much capacity to change or develop. They don't have a deeper resonance in terms of function on the whole. So I think what we've now been looking at is how do we create how do you generate creativity within a community or within individuals? How do you make people think in a more radical way, and how do you encourage people to reinvent instead of just reinterpret?
Und jetzt aber habe ich das Gefühl, die Kreativität ist etwas wie Sprache. Eine Sprache braucht man, wenn man miteinander in einer Firma diskutiert, wenn man in einer Familie ist, wenn man in einer Schule ist. Man braucht Sprache. Und die Kreativität ist auch so ein Werkzeug geworden, das man euch daheim, also eine Hausfrau ist ja kreativ, wenn man einen Bixo öffnet und sie keinen Bixo öffnet, dann müsst ihr euch eine Lesung finden, oder? Also die ist kreativ. Und so ist Kreativität ist quasi wie ein Handy, das man immer mit sich trägt und das man im Alltag in diesen Situationen anwendet.
So within the field where I'm placed as an artist, which is social engaged practice, of course you do your own projects, and they are very positive because they can also be places for trying something out, or you know, sometimes you need a temporary space to like experiment with something. So projects are great, but let's say within the industry I'm working in, it also becomes a commodity. You know, you get another call saying, oh, we are doing something, could you do a 6-month project with the community? You know, it becomes commodified. The project becomes commodified. That becomes your product within this market of social engaged practice, which is very good because you can earn a living. You know, you make another project and another project, and every project has the promise that it could be something bigger, but it often isn't. So it has a lot to do with my personal biography, that I got tired of this. I got also tired of this expectation, this call of like, oh, we have this thing, do you want to do another project? I was like, I really don't want to do another project. As a critique towards projectifying everything, a critique of not actually putting stuff into long-term projects. You know, why not give an artist £1 million and they can do something for 20 years? Why always just give like 10,000, 50,000? So it's a critique of this economy of buying in and commissioning social engaged practice, but also becoming aware of that many of the things that I have started with others have become organizational forms. You know, Myvillages is a foundation, Company Drinks is a community interest company, the Center of Plausible Economies with Cuba is running for 5 years. So I also wanted to take my own thinking seriously and saying, I need to think more about the reproduction of the things that I have created instead of thinking about the production of new projects. So it's both, yeah, it's both a personal desire to invest or sustain what I have started rather than starting more things. And it's a critique of the commodification of social engaged practice. To culturally wash, or you know what happens, you know, and there's real frustration, and I think especially the last years there's more and more frustration around, you get commissioned to do something about radical care, no impact. You know, you get commissioned to do something about the commons, no operational impact. And also, like, those who commission it as temporary practice. They don't commission it as long-term world building. And that's a fundamental critique. Also, in my approach to what art can be in relation to business, you know, it can be the thing that makes business look better by putting up paintings and sculptures. It can be the kind of provocateur that comes in on an interventionist level. You know, you come in and do something out of the box and creative and design thinking. But you hardly ever become operational. Lumbung Documenta, fantastic example. Lumbung is a practice. And Lumbung was meant to allow Documenta to be organized on different terms. You know, this is organizational practice. I'm not sure Documenta was really interested in this operational transformation and more interested in an exhibition. And that's a frustration I have with many colleagues, that we produce endless exhibitions around decolonizing, radical care, imaginary world building in institutions who have no commitment to change their own operations. So our projects always remain discursive spaces for potentially changing things, but without access to the tools we need. That's what I mean with operational. And that's a real frustration. You know, like, if the radical remains on the discursive within the exhibition, but never enters the organization, then you disconnect the artistic practice from its promise.
I mean, what I often say about the program here is the stuff that really is difficult is the everyday, is the working with the local rural community. That's where the real critical voice is, that's where you can't make mistakes. And then when we do things in the art world, it's kind of a relief. All we have to do is make sure it's kind of cool, and we can dick around and have fun. And yeah, How's It Worth show was like a lot of fun to do, because the art world they're not really that interested. As long as it kind of looks good. There's no particular deep analysis going on. and it gives you room to stretch out and play around with things. But we couldn't play around like that in a small community, in a rural place. You've got to define, constantly redefine what the point of it is, what the value of it is, and those things need to be demonstrated. We can't make mistakes here. We have one or two, and people still remind us. 10 years later, somebody will remind me about the Christmas lights.
I just wouldn't say I'm a problem solver, because I'm not sure if I ever solved any problem. But it's not that local issues aren't interesting to us. They are, but I guess solving is a bit too much. It is overestimating, because I guess we don't, it's not true. You don't solve, maybe you solve a tiny problem in some moment, like, oh, the space where the cigarette vending machine was is no longer needed. Well, let's put the International Village shop shelf there. Well, that is solving a problem if you want so, but that's nothing. Yeah. So, but on the other hand, it's underestimating, because if you're just like somebody who gives in some ideas, it's also underestimating the artistic capacity to have a concept and follow it through. So I would say just ideas. Well, I think, or at least for my artistic practice and for what I also like in other artists, is also, and then make it happen. It is really this energy of making it happen. So you have an idea and then you follow it. And so I think that's what some people could learn from art, that you can just be a bit stubborn in that, and you follow it and you make it happen.
And I think there's a kind of evangelical role within that of defining it and demonstrating it and showing it functioning and working, which is kind of very much underpins what we do here. The practical is, to me, incredibly important. If I just theorize about these ideas, they have little impact. Yeah, all that kind of art language of how important it is to make mistakes and stuff. It's actually really important not to make mistakes, to get it right and make it succeed. Failure is not it's not a solution.
And that's why I really like the action in it, and not only the talking. And I think that is empowering.
Vielleicht noch eine Überlegung ist euch, wenn man schaut, der Künstler vorher ist wie ein Einzelkämpfer gewesen, ein Stück weit. Und er hat euch Ansprüche gestellt. Er hat gesagt, nicht alle, aber viele Künstler haben gesagt, ich bin nötig in der Gesellschaft, so wie ich bin. Und hat einfach gesagt, ich soll euch in Anführungszeichen von der Gesellschaft akzeptiert sein so und soll euch unterhalten sein. Das heisst, er hat wie ein Stipendium wollen, verschiedene Arten von Leben. Und das kann für Einzelne korrekt sein, aber für mich persönlich, ich habe das Gefühl, ich wollte nicht nur, dass ich quasi ein Stipendium von der Gesellschaft habe und so lebe, sondern ich will euch im Rahmen von meinen Möglichkeiten etwas retour geben. Also es ist ein Austausch, Künstler und Gesellschaft und nicht ökonomisch. Aber der Weg ist nicht für jeden so. Das stimmt jetzt für mich so. Aber ich habe das Gefühl, es ist toller für mich, wenn mein Leben fertig ist und ich kann sagen, ich habe euch etwas der Gesellschaft gegeben.
We all have economic knowledge, we are all economic actors and bodies and subjects. But we are normally below the waterline because capitalism is so dominant and strong and successful. that our everyday economic knowledge is like, how do we organize community? How do we organize the commons? How do we organize a gift economy? Those economic knowledges are invisible, you know, they're below the waterline, but they're there. And to become confident of them and to use them and to claim them to be other than capitalist, which is a fine difference. You know, it's not anti-capitalist, it's other than capitalist. So that's what interests me as a kind of cultural and organizational question. How can we organize those other than capitalist economies in order to create shared cultural spaces?
Being able to pursue that, for me to pursue that as a profession, is one's working quite hard to position it constantly within ways that it is still viable. But I mean, that's almost the nature of the idea of art itself, that it is constantly having to reinvent and reposition itself, and that's a kind of, that almost illustrates it as a mindset. I don't really treat this job as a job. I treat it as a work of art.
As a way of living.
A way of living, yeah. I notice that when I start a project, I quite often say at an early stage to whoever it is that's commissioned it, this is going to be great fun. And then after the project, it takes me about 10 years to look back at it and go, that was great fun. Because, yeah, it's kind of tumultuous and problematic and difficult and confrontational often. And the same goes for the commissioner. I think they go into it thinking it's going to be exciting and challenging and fun, and they go through a kind of this is too challenging kind of process, and then 10 years later they go, that was an amazing experience.
Il y a beaucoup d'artistes assez originaux qui ne sont pas forcément dans les circuits, qui existent. Hein. Ils existent, d'ailleurs il y en a beaucoup. Peut-être même la question est-elle de savoir s'il n'y en a pas trop. Et donc ma réponse serait plutôt de l'ordre, concerne plutôt les gens qui veulent être artistes. Et la réponse, je l'ai trouvée chez Goethe, dans le livre qui s'appelle Les années d'apprentissage de Wilhelm Meister. Je vous la fais très très courte. Wilhelm Meister est un jeune homme qui est fou amoureux de théâtre. Et il est dans une famille de boutiquiers, de commerçants. Et il trouve évidemment sa famille extrêmement prosaïque, hein, sans ouverture. Et lui, il veut être artiste. Passe une troupe de théâtre ambulant, il part avec eux et il voyage avec eux pendant plusieurs années. Au bout d'un certain temps, il se rend compte qu'il est un mauvais acteur, il est un mauvais metteur en scène, il est un mauvais dramaturge, il est mauvais en tout. Et donc il rentre chez lui et il reprend le commerce de ses parents. Et donc on pourrait dire c'est un échec. Non, ça n'est pas un échec. Parce que dans ces années d'apprentissage, ce qu'il a appris, c'était ce qu'était une vie à travers l'art. Une vie qui est vécue donc à travers l'esthétique, à travers une vision esthétique de la vie. Et pas une vie justement qui serait vécue à travers le chiffre, quand les parents font le bilan à la fin de la journée de ce qu'ils ont gagné. Donc ça change complètement les choses. Et moi je suis persuadé que ce que nous sommes en train de vivre, c'est quelque chose d'un peu de ce style. Et qu'on ne pouvait pas imaginer il y a 40 ans. Parce que nous étions encore dans un monde de production qui était extrêmement dur. Et aujourd'hui, peut-être on a du temps, peut-être aussi on se dit que la production pour la production, on en a fait le tour. Peut-être qu'il y a quelque chose de cet ordre qui est en train de se passer, et nous sommes peut-être en train de faire cet apprentissage comme il y a 2 siècles, Wilhelm Meister.